Without even bothering to declare war, the German armies launched a coordinated attack across the neutral borders of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland.
As the Second World War raged on, the tank designs of various nations began to improve rapidly. Nations that entered the war with thinly armored vehicles barely able to stop a bullet were fielding tanks with greater firepower and armor than the world had ever seen before. While rival tank designs sought to improve to match these, another type of vehicle also made its debut, that being the tank destroyer. While some focused on making these even more heavily armed and armored than the tanks they would face, a new branch within the US military would take a different approach. Join me as we learn the story of the M10, America's most successful stopgap.
Before we get into the story of the M10 though, I have a special announcement to make. I've partnered with Aho Works to create a custom Helen the Hellcat Seek, Strike, Destroy patch, which is based on the tank destroyer branch emblem from the Second World War. Supplies of these are limited, so if you want to get one, be sure to check out the link below and order yourself one now for your collection. If you don't want a patch and you still want to support the channel, you can check out my merch, or you can support by going to warbricks.com and using my code ConeOfArc5 to save yourself 5% and support the channel. Now let's get back to the tank content.
The story of the 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage M10 began in 1941 alongside the formation of the United States Tank Destroyer Branch. Unlike the standard armored forces equipped with tanks who would be responsible for operations such as assaulting enemy positions, the goal of the tank destroyer units was to act as a defensive unit to respond to enemy armored breakthroughs. While even up to the end of the war, this would include towed anti-tank guns, the doctrine of rapid response to halt enemy tanks was a task best suited for self-propelled tank destroyers. A vehicle which fit both the firepower and speed requirements of the tank destroyer branch would eventually appear in 1944 with the introduction of the M10 Hellcat. In 1941, though, the US was about to enter into the Second World War, and despite the first steps towards the Hellcat having begun in November of that year, development of an entirely new vehicle would take time. With it unclear when this new vehicle would be ready, the decision to create a stopgap vehicle using existing parts was made. Work on this concept had already begun using the chassis of the medium tank M3, with 2 different prototypes being built and tested. The first of these, known as the T-24, was a turretless design mounting the 3-inch AA gun M3 with the standard M2A2 anti-aircraft mount. Testing of this design found it to be a stable platform, however it also revealed several flaws. For starters, it was simply too tall, which was less than desirable for a tank destroyer. It also could only depress the gun roughly 2 degrees rather than the 5 degrees which had been specified. This would lead to the cancellation of the T-24 project, with it being followed by the 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage T-40. Just like the T-24, this was an open-top turretless design, and you would be forgiven for mistaking the two as being the same vehicle at first glance. In fact, both prototypes were built using the same vehicle. The T-40 would carry the M1918 3-inch gun, this time mounted lower in the hull, allowing for a reduced overall height. Testing would prove successful, with it being accepted under the designation 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage M9, followed by an order for 50 vehicles. This did not progress further though, due to it both lacking sufficient mobility in the eyes of the tank destroyer board, as well as problems with the supply of M1918 guns, and in the end, none of the 50 would be built. It would also prove to be inferior to the turreted design being worked on, which would later become the M10.
Unlike the previous attempts, the next project would move on from the M3 Lee chassis, instead opting for the medium tank M4, or more specifically, the M4A2. The M4 Sherman itself was just beginning to roll off the production line, making it a perfect candidate for such a project. However, instead of the 75mm, this new design would utilize the 3-inch gun M7, the same found on the heavy tank M6. While the first version of this design, known as the T-35, would appear like a simple turret swap, the new turret and gun would not be the only changes from the original Sherman.
The first drawings of the T-35 were completed November 12, 1941, and initially it was the M4A1 which was chosen for this task. This would change in December though, with the M4A2 being chosen, followed by a wooden mock-up of the design in January. Initially, the turret was of a different design, being open both at the top and to the rear. However, by the completion of the first prototype, this had changed to a rounded cast turret with a partial roof. The armor was also altered, with the sides and rear being decreased to 1 inch 25.4mm. The front armor would remain at the original 2 inches 50.8mm, although the hull machine gun was removed and an additional armor plate was attached over the transmission housing. During testing in April of 1942, this design performed well, even keeping pace with the far lighter Gun Motor Carriage T1. As you can probably guess, the T-35 would not enter production though, being cancelled in favor of the T-35E1. Unlike the T-35, the T-35E1 saw a more significant design shift away from the M4A2 it was built on. Thanks to both reports from combat in the Philippines and tests at Aberdeen, the disadvantages of vertical armor plates were highlighted. This can be seen in both the design of the turret as well as changes to the side armor, with both featuring angled armor. Further testing would also reveal the cast turret armor performed worse than rolled armor of the same thickness, leading to the turret eventually being changed to a welded design. As for the hull, the front plate was reduced to 1.5 inches, 38.1mm, with the upper sides being reduced to 3/4 of an inch, 19mm, sloped at 38 degrees. This was done to reduce the overall weight of the vehicle, thus improving mobility, something favored by the tank destroyer branch as mentioned earlier. Concerns over the lack of armor caused by this were not ignored, with the decision being made to add mounting points, referred to as bosses, to the hull and turret. These were to mount additional armor plates with different thicknesses and spacings being tested. These tests found that having no spacing from the armor performed best, with several of the sources for this video indicating the thickness of these additional plates to be around 14mm to 17mm, but these may have varied further. While they added around a ton to the overall weight, this did not significantly impact the performance. It's unclear how many of these were issued to troops, or if any were, but photos do show that at least some crews fitted additional armor using the bosses. Many other photos also show them being used for alternative purposes, including mounting attachment points for storing various items. As for the turret, a replacement for the cast turret in the form of a welded hexagonal turret was proposed. However, due to problems with the design, a 5-sided turret was temporarily introduced. By the time these issues had been resolved, tooling had already arrived for the temporary solution, leading to it becoming permanent. This design consisted of 4 1-inch thick plates and a 2 3/4 inch 69.8mm gun shield. The partial roof was eliminated, reducing the protection for the crew somewhat, but also allowing for greater visibility and ventilation. This also eliminated the periscopes fitted to the original cast turret. The mount for the gun was a new simplified design, allowing for easy removal in the field and providing interchangeability with both the 105mm howitzer and British 17-pounder. With the installation of this turret atop the T-35E1 hull, we reach the final form of the M10. This was accepted for service as the 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage M10 on the 4th of June, 1942. Testing of the design proved favorable, with the prototype being deemed superior to the other tank destroyer designs under development at that time. As mentioned in my previous video on the M18 Hellcat though, it was still lacking in the eyes of the tank destroyer branch. For reference, when compared to a standard M4A2 which managed a sustained top speed of 25 miles per hour, the M10 only increased this to 30 miles per hour, 48 kilometers per hour. This obviously does not tell the whole story, as there is more to mobility than top speed. However, it does illustrate that the weight reduction did not massively change this as was desired by the tank destroyer branch. Still, with it sporting improved firepower over the medium tanks at that time and development still underway for its replacement, Production would begin in September of 1942.
Another factory in the arsenal of democracy. Here, the powerful new tank destroyers are forged in numbers that would stagger the enemy. Rolling out to the testing ground. Faster than the tank, the M10, as the Army calls it, is capable of destroying the heaviest armored vehicles yet seen in the field.
During the first month, 105 were delivered, with 4,993 being built by December of 1943. Additionally, 1,713 M10A1s were produced, with these being nearly identical except for the use of the Ford gasoline engine rather than the twin General Motors diesel engines. The final 300 of these were produced without turrets and would later go on to be used for production of the M36. Early on during production, several flaws were identified, with one of the most significant being the turret balance. Due to the long and heavy 3-inch gun and light armor of the turret, it was found that this made traversing the gun difficult when not on level ground. Initially, this was attempted to be resolved by attaching the track grousers on the back of the turret as well as fitting the 50 caliber machine gun to the rear. This was insufficient though, and instead counterweights were added which weighed a total of 3,600 pounds. With those attached, the recognizable shape of the M10's turret was finally complete. Not all M10s would receive the same style of counterweights, with around 2,850 receiving the wedge-shaped style. However, a further 3,200 would be fitted with the so-called duckbill style. That was not the only issue discovered, with others including the vehicle lacking sights for indirect firing and the slow turret traverse speed. The latter of these could have been resolved through the addition of a power traverse system, and this did see development. However, due to the production run of the M10 ending so quickly, this idea was abandoned, with it only appearing on the M36. Mounting of the M18 turret on the M10 hull was also proposed, with photos showing that one was indeed test fit. While this proposal did not succeed, possibly due to concerns over interference with M18 production, which began in June 1943, another project to mount the 76mm on an M10 hull did see development. Known as the 76mm Gun Motor Carriage T72, it featured a turret design quite similar to the M36 in shape, but again did not garner much interest as the M10's replacement had already arrived. I may discuss that project further in a future video of its own, but for the purposes of this video, I'll leave it there. If you do want to learn more though, pick up a copy of Can Openers by Nicholas Moran, as he goes over that and the M10 itself in far greater detail than I can here. As M10s rolled off the production lines, they were then distributed to the self-propelled tank destroyer battalions. While they now finally had a capable tank destroyer to call their own, it was not welcomed with open arms by higher command. While it did have a mobility advantage over the standard M4 Shermans, it was not the significant increase wanted by General Bruce. Regardless, with the vehicles ready for combat, no alternative available, and a war on, the M10 would be sent overseas with the tank destroyer battalions. Due to the larger number available, this was limited to the standard M10s, with the M10A1s remaining in the US. Later tests would actually deem the M10A1 to be the superior of the two, but by that point, the decision had already been made, so it was the diesels that would see combat. The first tank destroyer battalions would arrive in North Africa in January of 1943, equipped with this, the 75mm M3 GMC and the similar 37mm M6 GMC. M10s would begin to arrive in March, with the 776th and 899th Tank Destroyer Battalions seeing their combat debut sometime later that month. This first action of the new tank destroyers would be right to the letter of their doctrine, with them stopping a push from the 10th Panzer Division in its tracks. Of the 50 tanks, 30 would be destroyed at the cost of 20 M3s and 7 M10s. I definitely have to wonder how some of the crews felt seeing their buddies getting shiny new M10s while they were stuck in a truck with a gun strapped to it, especially after seeing nearly double the losses in one fight. Much of the combat seen by these initial M10s would not be like this, however, with much of their time spent in indirect fire roles. While this did assist in defeating the Axis forces during that campaign, the somewhat paradoxical nature of the tank destroyer doctrine led to considerable controversy. While in theory, the idea of a fast, heavily armed unit rushing to meet enemy tanks does make sense, at the same time, the fact remained that a regular tank could realistically do the same. This discussion would plague the tank destroyer branch for its entire existence, even after the introduction of more powerful vehicles like the M18 and M36. It did not stop the M10 from fighting, though, with them continuing on to the Italian front as well as Europe and in the Pacific. In Italy, these again saw significant use in indirect fire roles, firing thousands of high explosive shells. Tank combat also occurred, with the 3-inch guns making quick work of the common panzer types of that period, such as the Panzer IVs and Stugs. It would not truly be until the Normandy landings and the final push into Germany when the newer German tanks were encountered in significant numbers, with Tigers, Panthers, and the Elephant being relatively less common in Italy. One of the more interesting uses of the M10 in Italy did not actually involve their guns, though. 30 of them were modified for a special mission during 1944. Fitted with massive loudspeakers, these were used to play various sounds in attempts to fool the enemy. In total, 24 of these, referred to as special cars, were converted for this role with their guns replaced with dummy barrels. The remaining 6, called control cars, kept the guns but received other modifications for this role. These would see service during the early months of 1945 in Italy, as well as in France during August of 1944. Another variant, which was simply an M10 with the turret removed, would also see service as an artillery tractor. Known as the M35 Prime Mover, these were built using the hulls from M10A1s. The Canadians toyed with the idea of an M10 built using the chassis of their Ram 2 tank, however, this would not enter production.
By the time of the Normandy landings, the M10 made up the vast majority of the self-propelled battalions within the tank destroyer branch. In fact, only 3 of the 19 battalions were equipped with the newer M18 Hellcat. By that time, the M36 was also becoming available. However, similar to the decision not to send in the 76mm armed Shermans, it was deemed that the M10 would be sufficient. This would later be revealed to not be the case, as the Allies faced increasing numbers of Panthers following the D-Day invasion. While it was better than the 75mm armed Shermans, it still could not reliably defeat a Panther frontally at increased distances.
Despite this, as one account retold in Steven Zaloga's book on the M10 reads, the mere presence of these vehicles was enough to inspire courage within infantrymen. The account tells of a unit whose supporting M10s were delayed by a stream, leading to them beginning to retreat upon seeing the M10s were not with them. However, upon seeing that the M10s had finally crossed successfully, the infantry immediately turned around and re-entered the fight. This displays not just the importance of the M10 itself, but the impact any armored vehicle can have on morale. The M10 would continue to see combat for the remainder of the war, slowly being replaced by M18s and M36s. M10s saw service not just with the US, but also with Free French forces, who received 155 of them in 1943. The Soviets received a small number as well through the Lend-Lease program, although orders for these were quickly cancelled in favor of 76mm armed M4A2s. Commonwealth forces, including Britain, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and Polish regiments, would similarly make use of these tank destroyers. While some of these would remain armed with the 3-inch gun, the ability to swap the gun was taken advantage of, with the 17-pounder being fitted to upwards of 400 M10s. As mentioned before, this was a simple process thanks to the design of the gun mount, but due to the 3-inch gun's outer diameter being wider, a special casting was welded in place to close up the gap. This would lead to these M10s having a slightly altered appearance over their standard brethren. These were used by Commonwealth forces under the designation of Achilles 1C and 2C, or simply 17-pounder M10. Interestingly, one document also indicates the name Curate was to be used for the M10 in British service, however, this does not appear to have ever occurred. Similarly, the name Wolverine has often been assigned to the M10, but it is unclear where this originated. Some indicate it may have come from wartime advertising, although the only name I have found in any media from the period instead refers to it as the M10 Panther or Rolling Panthers. I may have been unable to find any mention of it using the name Wolverine, but if you are aware of anything from that period which does, please let me know, I would love to see it. Regardless, outside of the Achilles name, none of these appear to have been used during the war officially. When equipped with the 17-pounder, the M10 greatly exceeded the performance of the 3-inch gun, with it being one of the most powerful Allied guns during the war, as discussed in my video on the Sherman Firefly. The US would unfortunately not make use of this themselves despite this superior performance. There were valid reasons for this, such as production and supply concerns, but that is a topic for another time. Captured M10s would see limited use by the Germans. However, the most notable M10-inspired vehicle they would field would be the Ersatz M10. These were Panthers modified to look like Allied M10s, with them intended to sneak through enemy lines. Overall, the wartime service of the M10 can be viewed as a success. While it did feature more limited protection and its fair share of flaws, it provided troops with increased firepower otherwise only available through towed AT guns. We must also remember that this was only ever intended as a stopgap until a proper replacement could be produced. Once the M18 Hellcat entered service and the Sherman itself received the 76mm gun, the fairly minor mobility advantage offered by the M10 was of little consequence. This would not be the end of its story though, as it not only directly led to the creation of the M36, but would also remain in service after the war with several nations. The British would keep some 17-pounder armed examples in service post-war, as well as exporting them to Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Egypt. Egypt would go on to use these against Israeli forces in several conflicts during the following decades. Israel themselves would similarly acquire some, equipping several with a French 75mm gun. A small number also made their way into service with the Republic of China, with some online sources claiming them to have been purchased from the US as surplus. Photos show several of these with their original armament prior to them being modified to use the Japanese Type 91 105mm howitzer, as well as featuring additional roof armor. This would not be the only use of these in Asia, as a small number may have also been given to the Republic of Korea by the US during the Korean War alongside M36s. The vast majority, though, would be scrapped due to them being deemed obsolete. Thankfully, there are still a multitude of examples of this vehicle both in private hands and on display around the world, preserving this important piece of World War II history. What are your thoughts on the M10 though? Was it an underrated vehicle, a complete waste of time and resources, or was it simply the best temporary solution available? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to grab your custom Helen the Hellcat tank destroyer patch from Aho Works with the link below, or support the channel by grabbing some other merch such as my new Lerva themed design. As always, thank you to all my ConelyFans for supporting my content, and a massive thanks to the American Heritage Museum for allowing me to film on location with some of their vehicles. Be sure to visit them if you're ever in the area, as they are probably one of the best tank museums on the East Coast. I'll leave a link below if you want to learn more. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the previous episode on the M18 Hellcat, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming video on the M36. Hope to see you there.